Just want to first off thank you all so much for coming to what, as you know, is the sixth and final iteration of our Anti-Imperialist Summer School. Grateful to have you all here. It's been really fun to learn with everyone as we've been putting the series together over the last 6 weeks, and excited to hear folks' feedback. Definitely do share any feedback or thoughts or suggestions, because this whole thing has been an experiment for the chapter, our first time doing something like this, and we want to do it again in the future, but want to make sure it's even better next time. So today's session is sort of taking a step back. Over the last 5 weeks, we have really gotten into the weeds of different aspects of how empire functions in the world today, everything from the trade system to dollar imperialism to the NGO industrial complex and more. And as we conclude the series today, we wanted to sort of take a step back, look at the shifting global order, both the ways the global order and the balance of power within it has changed over the last 100 years or so, but also, as folks probably know, we are living through a moment of very profound change. Chinese President Xi Jinping says that we're living through changes unseen in a century. I think that feels very true. So we wanted to take this session to sort of evaluate and examine some of those changes and sort of make sense of them in light of everything we've covered so far. Week one was titled What is Imperialism? And that was sort of a bird's eye view of understanding imperialism from a Marxist perspective, understanding it as a world system of political economy as opposed to, just a bygone historical phenomenon or just a practice that states engage in. And we offered up a definition of imperialism that will be on the next slide that I will return to in just one second. And then in the subsequent weeks, week two, we covered sanctions, trade, and dollar imperialism, particularly the way that the global trade regime and the function of the US dollar as a global reserve currency upholds unequal exchange between the imperial core and the global south, the periphery, and how that reinforces imperialism on a world scale. Week three, we built on that to cover international finance and empire, the role of the IMF, the World Bank, but also private financial institutions on Wall Street and elsewhere in reinforcing patterns of debt and dependency among global South countries. Week four, we looked at USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the NGO industrial complex, and sort of the role of soft power in upholding specifically American empire. And then week five, last week, we covered international governance, so international legal institutions, the UN, sort of the governing systems and structures of the current world order that provide a framework for all of this. And so that brings us to today's session. And before we get into that, before I pass it off to Stacy to sort of run us through some of the shifts that we've seen in the global order over the last 100 years or so, I want to return to the definition of imperialism that we offered at the very beginning of the course, challenging the common misconceptions that people often have about how imperialism functions. Again, one, either as a bygone historical phenomenon, a thing of the past that needs to be repaired, but not an ongoing process. Instead, conceiving it as something that does very much exist and shape our world today. And then thinking of it as a world system, not just a practice or a policy that states engage in, but a world system to which every state is integrated in various ways, that's characterized by an unequal division of labor between nations. So some countries are expected to produce, and export cheap raw materials and be sort of manufacturing centers, but they import the real finished goods and really high value add goods and services from the global north. And that reinforces inequality. And the other key characteristic is, of course, the unequal exchange, the exploitative transfer of wealth, value, labor, and resources from the underdeveloped periphery to the imperial core. And that, there's a lot of mechanisms that reinforce the system: military intervention, sanctions, other forms of diplomatic and economic coercion, but those are all parts of a much bigger picture. They are not imperialism in and of themselves. So I just wanted to return to sort of this definition that we offered in the first session as sort of a grounding to guide folks thinking in our discussion. And with that, I will pass it off to my comrade Stacy to take us through the next part, tracing the evolution of the international order.
Thank you. So, as we've just discussed and as we have been exploring for the past couple of weeks, we know that imperialism is a very expansive, totalizing system. So, this is going to be like a very, very quick jaunt through the later history of the international order, kind of modern imperialism. I wouldn't even call this the greatest hits, but there are some touchstones and turning points and themes that I think will be really important for how we think about our present moment. And a lot of this really should feel familiar if you've been keeping up with this summer school. I want to start with what was then called the new imperialism. So in the late 19th to early 20th century, this is where we get what to us is now a sort of classical form of imperialism, especially when we compare it to neocolonialism, which was articulated by Nkrumah and Rodney. This is classical in that this is more that form of dominance and extraction that really corresponds with the development of capitalism. And indeed, we could say that imperialism, this new imperialism, is the development of capitalism itself. And so the second industrial revolution is really important. This is where we see the enhancement of European military might, but also the capacity for production. And these are going to be really important bases for imperialism and how these European powers, especially Great Britain, which sort of got a head start, can really continue to expand. And we can see where their material interest is in continuing to expand. This is when we see mercantilism kind of fall away as the common sense for economics. So the idea of protectionism remains, but it's very different when you contrast it with the rise of free trade, which again was something that Great Britain was first out of the gate to really champion, and something that other potential or contemporary European powers were having to strategically move against. We'll also see that the economic crises of the 19th century going into the 20th century take on a much different character. They're very international because we're seeing that the international economic system is becoming further enmeshed in this new way. We see it with the panic of 1873 through 1893. These were the biggest economic crises in a century. And we also know that that would pale in comparison to the Great Depression, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Through those economic crises, it was understood that continuing to capture new markets, to source more like cheap raw materials, to continue to expand was a way out, was a way to change the balance of trade. And so we see states that have newly come together, like Germany and Italy. We're seeing the US as it kind of steps out onto the world stage, seeing opportunities to challenge Great Britain's dominance and sort of head start into this new imperialism. And so, with all of these material considerations for their interests, all of their new moves on the world stage, we're also seeing that the ideologies of white supremacy are evolving to keep pace with this. And so, we hear more discussion of the civilizing mission that is imperialism. We also hear more about a white man's burden. The civilizing mission is something that was posited as a greater good, a social good for people who are less developed. There's this idea that these, especially non-white people, are capable of development of civilization, but Europe, being the center of civilization, has the capacity to help them develop. And it is very convenient that at the same time that they do that, they're able to integrate them into this economic system and engage in more extraction. There are some isolationists who disagree with this idea. They're still white supremacists, but they believe that world power shouldn't have anything to do with these lesser peoples. This is where that idea of the white man's burden comes in, that this is an obligation. This is a reference to Rudyard Kipling's piece imploring the US to get involved with the Spanish-American War, nominally in support of the Philippines against the Spanish, that this is a white man's burden to help to bring civilizations to the world, to help to support their development. But we know that this development is going to be uneven. It's never meant to bring parity to these different nations and states. And this is happening all over the world, not just in Africa. It's happening throughout Latin America. It's happening throughout Asia and the Pacific. But I do think that the scramble for Africa is a really interesting moment to sort of analyze and see how imperialism is developing. This is kicked off by Great Britain making moves towards Egypt in the late 19th century. At the time, into the latter half of that century, Europe didn't have much of a presence in the African continent. They were mostly on the coast, about 10% of the continent, not much in the interior, many different peoples sort of having a sovereignty or at least not being incorporated into the world system. But at this time, again, with the pressure and the opportunities that are presented by imperialism, different European powers are seeing that they can source raw materials and labor much more cheaply. They can capture new markets for their finished goods. They can establish new military and commercial bases, especially thinking about the logistics of moving goods throughout the world. Very convenient to have a foothold on this continent. And again, for everyone who is not Great Britain, it's a chance to contest its dominance. Of course, in the case of the British, it's a chance to maintain it, since everything appears to be up for grabs. And so the Berlin Conference It's not that it necessarily like put any of this into effect. All of these are sort of processes and pressures that had already been in progress. But again, a really interesting moment following the Franco-Prussian War. So this is when Germany is kind of formalizing itself as a state. It has defeated France, starting to pose a bit of a threat or become more of a rival to Great Britain, joins with 13 other nations to have a conference in Berlin discussing how it is that Africa will be divided up. And so we'll see that 7 of these nations are able to come away with possessions, whereas 7 other nations did not. So we'll see that the United States was invited, but didn't leave with a piece. The Ottoman Empire was invited, didn't leave with a piece. But with the Berlin Conference, they were able to sort of formalize what it is under a sort of international law that European claims on the continent would look like. This was meant to temper inter-imperialist rivalries, keep them from getting into further war with each other, have a sort of gentlemanly way of figuring out how they're going to divvy this up, maintain sovereignty, be able to hold on to that claim. At the same time, there is a nominal commitment to the end of slavery, but at the same time, a very clear, explicit material interest in further extraction and dominance. So interesting, again, to see ideology sort of says something liberal, freedom for people, but in practice, it is not about guaranteeing that at all. And we see that there are some parts of Africa left independent, but they too will sort of come under imperialist colonization. But these regions were not actually parties to the Berlin Conference. They were not considered peers in that way. So again, interesting to think about this conception of how European powers see themselves versus others. Also want to go over the development from sort of mid-19th century going into World War I at the time of the US and of Russia as an interesting compare and contrast. And so the US, as we know, 19th century, most pivotal point in its at least domestic history is the Civil War. It results in emancipation and the end of slavery in the United States. But we also know that that was not, again, on the basis of like a commitment to that true liberal ideal that everyone should be free. It is something that made sense strategically for that war. And that is something that the rest of Europe responded to, seeing that their source of cotton from the Confederacy was at risk. Forces like Great Britain and France strategically chose to stay neutral in the fight. France looking at this sort of delicate balance of power, France was not able to truly intervene without Great Britain's commitment. Great Britain had some blockade runners, so sort of bypassing the Union's blockade of the South, but they found that they were able to sort of make up that difference between what was lost in the cotton shortage and what was gained by continuing trade with the North. And so we see that we can have this shift from a very slave labor intensive economy and production of cotton, which is really important, to something that still fits into the world system. After this, the US is able to shift more from isolation to expansion. It's very much a contest, it's very much a debate, but we see that once the US remains the United States, westward expansion is continued. We see this with railroads, which are able to go all the way to the West Coast. A lot of that involved foreign investment, especially from European firms. With that, there's this continuing idea that the United States deserves to be a world power. The way to do this is by having a series of ideas that say that in this hemisphere, the United States is going to be the arbiter of what development looks like. It will serve that purpose, not the European powers. The Monroe Doctrine is very flexible in that way. At sometimes it is saying that it is anti-interventionist, it is anti-imperialist, saying that especially with other states of the South, with Latin America, there should be no intervention. At other times, it evolves to state that the US has the right to intervene. It's doing so in a civilizing mission. It is doing so in defense of development of the Western Hemisphere, in contrast with Europe. And all of this leads to a more decisive involvement by the US in World War I, especially considering that basically none of that war was fought in this hemisphere, very much had an outsized influence on what the end of the war looked like and what peace would look like and on what terms. And I want to contrast that with Russia. So middle of the 19th century Russia, there was also massive emancipation of 23 million serfs. This was done by the emperor in a bid to sort of hold on to that autocracy. But we'll see that this and other reforms would not be sufficient. social unrest continued. And so we saw that that continued to put pressure. That would then force the imperial monarchy to establish a state legislature to become a constitutional monarchy. But when those reforms didn't really pan out the way that people expected after 1905, that sort of turmoil and unrest culminated in 1917 with two revolutions. And usually when we think of the Russian Revolution, we think of the October Revolution, where we see the abolition of that monarchy and the establishment of the first socialist state. And so riding on this popular victory and especially popular turn against the Great War, the Bolsheviks were able to withdraw from World War I by entering into an agreement with the Central Powers, did so at the loss of a lot of significant territory, and also did so earning the ire of the Allied powers. So we'll see that towards the end of World War I and into the 20s, there will be intervention from the Allied powers. So from Great Britain, from France, from the US, from Japan in response to this. And again, we're starting to see how the lines and divisions are being redrawn, who is an ally and who are the inter-imperial rivals. All right, so continuing to kind of speed along, and we're just going to go faster and faster until we return to the present moment. But the fallout of the Great War includes, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. Again, the US played an outsized role in that. But there were a lot of different interests kind of keeping these inter-imperialist rivalries in mind. France had been largely deindustrialized by Germany's attacks, and so wanted to make sure that Germany did not have the capacity to continue outproducing, outdeveloping, possibly threatening, especially along the border that they shared. On the flip side, Great Britain also wanted its restitutions, but wanted to maintain Germany as a viable trading partner, wanted to make sure that France didn't become too dominant, was also wary of what was going on with now Soviet Russia. And the United States still has some almost isolationist but unique demands and wants from the end of this war. And so they are advocating for new international governance. How can we keep this balance of power? How can we make sure that there is, at least in name, more autonomy from all of the states that have been affected by this? How can we ensure that there will be more free trade in the future? Again, thinking about how the US can benefit from this and not be closed out of all of the new territory, new markets that have opened up. And so we see in Wilson's 14 points, a really large part of that is the establishment of the League of Nations. League of Nations, I think we discussed last week and a couple weeks ago, presented a blueprint for international governance as we know it now with the UN, with international finance firms, the World Bank and the IMF. But this is also where we see the mandate system. And the mandate system was a way of expropriating and taking away Germany's colonial holdings outside of Europe and within parts of Europe and divvying it up among the different world powers. But again, that civilizing mission in mind. Some mandates were considered closer to full development, to civilization. So we're seeing that places like the Levant and Western Asia are more ready for independence. And so there's an obligation to continue stewarding them and to pass off autonomy in the near future to whoever is granted those holdings. We're seeing that in Asia, the Pacific, in Africa, those states are considered less developed. And so their holdings will look different. After World War II, after the Treaty of Versailles, all of these conflicts in some ways still persist. And that, coupled with the further enmeshment of the international economy, leads to the Great Depression. So where there is a great boom time because money is able to cross borders to be invested abroad, so too we see that there is a lot of fallout when capitalism hits a really, really big crisis. And so the development after that of a way of recovering also continued to shift the world order. We see that the US is stepping more and more onto the world stage, is able to play a larger role, which is really important when we get into World War II. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the development of fascism and also talk about the concept of the imperial boomerang, which is something that you'll see Aimé Césaire develop. We'll see, I think Michel Foucault is often given credit for that idea, but it was in reference to Aimé Césaire. And Hannah Arendt also wrote a bit about this. But the argument is that what Europe was doing, especially Germany, especially during that era of new imperialism, all of that was perfectly capable of happening within Europe. So seeing that Germany still wanted to expand its territory, still wanted to rebuild, and was willing to do that from within the heart of Western civilization, from within Europe, this forms a really important basis for fascism. It's also important to note that the only use of nuclear weapons by any state in history so far is by the US at the end of World War II. Nuclear proliferation will continue to be an issue into the 20th century. It will be a factor in how different countries interact with each other. And again, we'll see questions about who deserves to have those armaments, who doesn't, who gets to decide who has the power to proliferate versus who gets to regulate, and so on. After World War II, we're starting to see a crystallization of the liberal international order. And this is also how we can understand the bipolarity of the Cold War, but we can also sort of split the world into three spheres. So we have the first world, we have the Western liberal democracies. We've talked about Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan as a way of economically providing a base for this. We have NATO, which provides the military arm, especially in contrast to the second world, to the Soviet bloc, to the Eastern bloc, against socialism, against communism. And the UN is nominally supposed to represent the entire world, but is definitely far more in alignment with the first world, with the ideas of liberal democracy and how those should spread. We have the second world, again, led and sort of stewarded by the Soviet Union. These are countries that are within the Eastern Bloc or aligned with it. In sort of a counterbalance to NATO, they form the Warsaw Pact. So similarly, different nations coming together, seeing that their inter-imperialist rivals, or at least their rivals are another bloc, changes how they interact with each other. And then we have the third world, not aligned, but we'll see that different parts of this so-called third world, so essentially everyone else, will lean more towards the first world or the second world. But we'll have the non-aligned movement sort of shows up as a contrast to the United Nations. We'll see different colonized people coming together to fight for decolonization, different arguments and discussion about what constitutes decolonization. Again, we can think about Nkrumah, Walter Rodney, and all of those who theorize on neocolonialism, how decolonization does not necessarily mean the end of that colonial relationship. And so we see the rise of pan-nationalisms like Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism. These are national struggles that also attempt to think more on this world scale about how different colonized people can come together in the same way that the first world does to represent their interests. In particular, I want to talk about Pan-Arabism and how it emerges and has a big debt to Nasser in Egypt. So thinking about the role that Egypt has played even going back into the 19th century. We see that with the fall of Nasser's government in Egypt, that opens up a lot of opportunities for First World to contest what is going on in that region. And we'll see that different forms of intervention will take place there, throughout Latin America, throughout Asia, different hot wars, different coups, different ways of intervening. There is more openness to intervention, especially from the First World, but again, in the name of liberal democracy. So having, in some ways, an updated civilizing mission. And then, with the fall of the Soviet Union, we have the rise of this idea of the end of history. This comes from Francis Fukuyama, who wrote an essay in 1989, a book in 1992, positing that if history is an ideological evolutionary process, then Western liberal democracy is the endpoint of government. It is the apotheosis. This doesn't mean that nothing's ever going to happen again, but that a sort of norm has been established. More and more countries will pursue Western liberal democracy, will pursue capitalism and neoliberalism in that form, that the ideological fight is done. Communism's over, socialism's over, there are no alternatives. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the thesis of the clash of civilizations. It says that Francis Fukuyama is wrong, but perhaps not for the reasons that we would say here. It says that conflict will continue to evolve based on cultural and religious identities that form civilizations. And here we see some very interesting divvying up of the world into different civilizations based on religious and cultural identities. A really big one, at least according to this thesis, is that of the Islamic world, how it brushes up against and conflicts with Western Christendom. And so the end of history enjoys about a decade of prominence of people saying, this seems to be about right. But that falls apart with 9/11 and the so-called global war on terror. We've been talking about, again, clash of civilizations, civilizing missions, bringing liberal democracies to the world, helping underdeveloped people see what freedom and autonomy can look like. This ideology develops over these centuries, but we can see that the global war on terror, the US's rationale for continuing to intervene around the world, the way that it engages in warfare, really blows up this idea and leads us to the present day, where there is a lot that is still being contested. I'll hand it back to Brene.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacey, for that. I know you really had the more difficult part of this of kind of running through like world history up until the present moment, but you did a great job of sort of queuing up what I want to talk about now, which is our present moment and like the current shifts we're undergoing in the global order. And before I really get into that, I think just to really underscore something that Stacey was talking about with this idea of the liberal international order, I think it's important to emphasize that liberalism as sort of a political framework has always been very, very intimately tied up with imperialism. If we think again of imperialism as the global system of political economy by which wealth is plundered from the periphery, from the global south to the countries of the imperial core, liberalism developed very much as a way to provide an ideological justification for that. There's a lot of scholarship about particularly the British Empire playing a very key role in the development of liberal thought. And I think we really see that come to a head in the post-Second World War era. As Stacey said, that is where particularly Britain and France, these European empires, they saw the writing on the wall. Their colonies were starting to engage in national liberation struggles. Some had already won independence. Their economies were devastated. Their militaries were devastated by the Second World War. The US was relatively unscathed and was really, we had the nuclear bomb. We were the dominant power in the world. And so that's where you see the sort of coalescing of the countries of the imperial core into a central sort of bloc that is underpinned by this project of liberal internationalism, the idea that the countries of Europe and the United States, this transatlantic alliance, they should cooperate, they should work together. The United States will be at the helm of that system, but European powers and then Australia, later on Japan, and so on, will sort of be integrated into that as junior partners who play a role in upholding that system as well. And so what we've come from is a system in the 17th, 18th century where you still have imperialism being structured by the unequal exchange between the core and the periphery, but the core is fractured among competing empires. Now, by the middle of the 20th century and into the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, you have the core has really solidified into a unified bloc. What we're seeing right now is really a fracturing of that liberal international order in many ways, both in terms of a fracturing in the relationships between countries in the imperial core, but also a fracturing of the hegemony that the United States has really enjoyed, particularly since the end of the Cold War, since the rise of a unipolar world where the US is the most powerful, undisputed hegemonic force on Earth. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to run through some of the many shifts that we're seeing in the global order right now. Starting with, of course, the rise of right-wing nationalism. This is something that has been commented on increasingly, really, since the early to mid 2010s, when you had, first in Europe, these right-wing, anti-immigrant, national populist parties starting to gain power, Trump's election in 2016. And whether in the US or in Europe, the rise of right-wing authoritarian national populism is really a response to the failures of neoliberalism, of a globalization of the economy, which deindustrialized many of these countries as production is shifted to global south countries where it's cheaper, labor costs are lower. That ends up screwing over the working class in the United States, in Germany, and France, and so on, fuels these resentments that are very easily capitalized on by populist politicians who can blame immigrants, blame other countries, and so on. And that fuels this rise of right-wing nationalism characterized by anti-immigrant backlash, growing militarism and jingoism, and then a retreat towards protectionist economic policies and trade wars. I would say there's sort of been two waves of this. You had a wave in the 2010s. That was when the first Trump administration came to power. You had a rise of these parties in Europe. And then there was sort of a backpedaling. The Biden administration, starting in the early 2020s, was sort of a last gasp of classic liberal internationalism. But we're seeing now that that has really rolled back, right? The far right across the West is coming back in greater force. Trump, of course, won the 2024 election, has surged back to power, but in Europe as well, just this February in Germany, in the Bundestag elections, the AfD, which is the neo-Nazi far-right party, became the second largest party in the German parliament. Last year in the UK election, Nigel Farage's far-right Reform Party won the third highest share of the vote, and this is a new party in, the UK's political context. It won 14.3% of the vote. In the previous election in 2019, it had won just 2% of the vote, and we've seen this in so many other countries. There was just a far-right politician who won the presidency in Poland a couple of weeks ago, and this is happening across Europe, but also in the global south as well. There's been the rise of figures like Modi in India, Javier Milei in Argentina, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and so on. And with this, particularly with this rise of far right in the global south, we're seeing an increasingly internationalist dimension of this right-wing nationalism. And what I mean by that is that these nationalist movements in different countries are increasingly coming together, learning from each other, cooperating with one another. Just to give some examples, last year here in DC, there was the National Conservatism Conference, which I actually attended with a press pass and got to see these people in person. And this featured former UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman, who's a famous right-wing nationalist, one of Hungary's political advisors, is Balázs Orban, who is no relation to the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but is like one of the key right-hand men of that far-right government, as well as other far-right leaders from around the world. In the last few years, CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, has featured speakers like Javier Milei from Argentina, Nayib Bukele from El Salvador, Giorgia Meloni from Italy, and so on as well. So we're seeing a growing sort of internationalization of the far right. And so that is one of the key things. And, here in the United States, of course, we're seeing this manifest in the form of Trump and the MAGA movement, which has, particularly since the second administration came to power this year, has led to a fragmenting of the liberal internationalism that has underpinned the US-Europe alliance. This was a key feature of the global order from the post-war era onwards, this idea of transatlanticism you often hear talked about, which is the idea that the US and Europe are very close partners in upholding global capitalism, upholding global security. But Trump has really reshaped this relationship with Europe. He has not pursued a full decoupling from Europe. He sort of threatened that at various points and sort of nodded in that direction rhetorically. But instead, what he's done is essentially, whereas previous presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, always had a very quote unquote ironclad commitment to a close partnership with the US and Europe, Trump is much more opportunistic. He's much more interested in pursuing what he perceives to be America's national interests. And the relationship is more transactional. So he sees this relationship as a way to throw America's weight around and bully Europe into making sure they know they are second tier to the United States. He's threatened 50% tariffs on all imports from the EU, claiming that European countries have banded together to take advantage of the US through trade. And I think a really key example of this is Trump's approach to NATO. He, since 2015, has threatened to withdraw the US from NATO, and he's never actually done that. But because of that threat, that has sort of sparked so much fear among European leaders that it has enabled Trump to essentially force them to increase their commitments of defense spending. Previously, NATO countries had to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. As of this NATO summit from just a couple of weeks ago, they now have to spend 5% of their GDP, which is a huge increase, and one that, of course, comes at the expense of health spending, education spending, social welfare. This is austerity that is shifting towards rearmament of Europe, using the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine as justification for that. But this has really driven a wedge into the US-Europe relationship. And of course, Trump is continuing to remain in NATO, but the nature of that relationship and the power dynamics at play have really changed. And so we've seen, this rearmament of Europe. And this is a quote from an op-ed that just last week, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had in the Financial Times, where they're talking about Germany and France increasing their defense spending. In fact, Germany is now talking about reinstating compulsory military conscription in the draft as well, which is something that hasn't happened since pre-reunification. And I just want to highlight one part of this quote in particular, this very euphemistic phrasing of a world in which our allies will have other dilemmas and priorities. That's very clearly a nod to the fact that the US is stepping back from the sort of security partnership it has pursued with Europe for the last 75 years. And that is, of course, being framed by these leaders. They don't want to frame it as a humiliation to their countries. So they're framing it as something they're sort of doing of their own accord. But really, this is sort of a capitulation to Trump and the way that he's throwing the United States weight around in this relationship. And so what this is manifested in is a really dramatic increase in defense spending on the part of European countries. And this graph shows a steady decline throughout the 90s and early 2000s. But starting in 2020, and then especially after 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, a really sharp increase in total defense spending on total percent of GDP across the EU. And that's going to increase even further now that they have this 5% spending commitment as well. So that is one very, key shift that's going on in the global order. Another one, of course, is the genocide in Gaza and the reverberations that has had on a global scale. I think I can't underscore enough how much the genocide has really shattered the myth of the liberal international order, right? Especially when you sort of consider how the West has responded to Gaza versus how they responded to the invasion of Ukraine, the treatment of, Ukrainian refugees versus the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza. I think for a lot of countries in the global South, they've always known, because they've been at the receiving end of imperialist violence for decades and centuries, they've known that this is a lie, but now this is really, the mask has come off entirely, right? And as a result, what we've seen is that countries in the global south are now feeling empowered in ways they haven't historically to really stand up to the West. After the genocide began in October 2023, 11 countries in the global south started to downgrade or sever ties with Israel, either, recalling their ambassadors from Israel or cutting ties altogether in the case of countries like Colombia. South Africa brought this genocide case against Israel before the ICJ, which was unprecedented. That hasn't really happened before. And it's notable that since then, 21 different states across the global south, plus 4 international organizations, that's the African Union, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Arab League, have all joined South Africa's genocide case in support. And I think the fact that last year, it was more than a year ago now, that the court ruled that Israel is plausibly committing genocide and ordered Israel to stop what it's doing in Gaza. Of course, that hasn't happened, and things have only gotten so much more horrific. I think that has only further underscored the complete bankruptcy of this idea of the liberal or rules-based international order as well. And then finally, earlier this year in January, 8 countries, Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa, came together to form what's called the Hague Group in partnership with the Progressive International, with the stated purpose of bringing these countries together to enforce international law against Israel. And next week, they're convening an emergency meeting in Colombia, in Bogota, where they're going to announce, quote, concrete actions to enforce international law through coordinated state action to end the genocide and ensure justice and accountability. And so all of these are examples of global South countries really taking Israel, and by extension, the United States and the entire sort of Western liberal order, which has backed Israel to the hilt, taking them to task and using these institutions that are on, like international legal systems, that on paper are supposed to be an equal playing field, but we know in practice are not, but really like highlighting the hypocrisy, right? Showing that they're going to, in whatever way they can, try and stand up against the global north on this question of the genocide. And I think this quote from Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, really drives this point home. This was an interview he gave with Democracy Now! Quote, when I compare the situation of Palestine with the situation of Ukraine, I want to show a parallelism in the situations. There's military occupation in both countries, but a different attitude among world powers. He calls this the hypocrisy of international policy. And so again, global South leaders are very, very keenly aware that like the way the West has responded to Palestine versus Ukraine could not be more night and day, and that there is like a fundamental hypocrisy there. I know I'm really harping on this, but to me, that is like a generational shift in terms of like this liberal international ideology that has underpinned the world system for the last 75 years has been completely shattered by the genocide. So that's like a really important shift to highlight. Another one I want to talk about is the rise of China over the last 20 years, and really in the last 10 years in particular, as a real superpower on the world stage. But more importantly than it being a superpower that challenges the US in many ways, China has increasingly and very intentionally positioned itself as a partner, both economically and diplomatically, for global South countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, but also in its immediate backyard in Asia as well, and positioned itself as an alternative to the West. If, when global South countries want to get loans or other development assistance to engage in infrastructure development, historically they've had to turn to Western banks. They've had to turn to the IMF, the World Bank, where, as we know from previous sessions, they're getting a really, really bad deal. China offers them better terms. It offers them fairer terms. And that is why we're seeing global South countries increasingly turn voluntarily towards China and away from the West. These two graphs here show, which were on the slides from the second week as well, but I wanted to bring them back up because they show from 2000 to 2024 which countries in the world have the US versus China as their largest trading partner. In 2000, all of South America traded more with the US than with China. At 2024, South America, almost all of South America now trades more with China than the US. And that has been a steady trend over the last 25 years. And then, of course, there's also the Belt and Road Initiative, this massive infrastructure investment project that China launched in 2013, but has really ramped up in the last few years to partner with primarily global South countries. So to give you a sense of the scale of this initiative, as of October 2023, this involves 151 partner countries that had various, one or more projects partnering with China through this Belt and Road Initiative. These countries have a combined population of 5.1 billion people, and the total investments China from this initiative thus far have totaled more than $1 trillion. So this is like a really enormous scale, and this is China partnering with countries to build roads, bridges, ports, really necessary infrastructure for the economic development and sovereignty of global South countries. I do want to just like speak really quickly to the sort of myth that we often hear talked about of Chinese neocolonialism or debt trap diplomacy, something that you hear about that China is essentially doing the same thing in particularly Africa that the West has always done. There are absolutely contradictions, like in China's relationships with African countries. There are exploitative relationships with, Chinese corporations owning mines in the Congo is where you see this in particular, right? Where there are really horrific violations that also exist in the same relationships that exist with Western corporations. But there have been countless studies that have shown that there is no evidence, contrary to what the State Department and others claim, that China engages in predatory lending with the goal of seizing state assets or gaining geopolitical influence. In fact, countries are voluntarily choosing to partner with China for development because they are getting a better deal. There's a famous quote from a Kenyan government official who said that every time China visits, we get a hospital, and every time Britain visits, we get a lecture. You could also say every time America visits, they get a lecture as well. And there's a very famous case in, I think, 2010 or 2014, when within the span of a month, both the Chinese foreign minister and then America's Secretary of State, John Kerry, visited Ethiopia for various summits, and they gave speeches. And if you compare the nature of the speeches, China's foreign minister is talking about the shared histories of imperial humiliation and exploitation that China and Africa have faced, and the need for cooperation, mutual development, mutual benefit. And then John Kerry is just lecturing African leaders about the need to promote good governance, the need to fight corruption, promote democracy, and essentially telling them that the U.S. can teach them the way. It is just that same civilizing mission all over again. And one key benefit you see from this that the global south is getting out of this is that China, unlike the US, unlike Western countries, is much better about engaging in technology transfer. So it's not just investing to build factories and build these projects, but then also like providing expertise and providing the technology, particularly for green technology, whether that's building electric vehicles or other sort of like renewable energy infrastructure, so that countries in the global south are able to develop their own economic base to facilitate a green transition in the face of the climate crisis. That's something that you're not really getting out of these countries' relationships with the West, where it is much more one-sided and much more premised on exploitation and unequal exchange. And there's a strong emphasis in China's overall foreign policy approach on multilateralism and sovereignty. This is a quote from a speech that Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave last September at the United Nations General Assembly, where he says, quote, "We should advocate an equal and orderly multipolar world and see that all countries have their own place and role in the multipolar system. We should practice true multilateralism, oppose hegemonism and power politics, and make international relations more democratic." And there's a strong emphasis on cooperation, mutual benefit. Again, China is benefiting from these. That's why they're doing it. It's not out of the goodness of their heart, but there's an emphasis on mutual benefit and mutual development, which you don't see from the West. And of course, this has terrified the American ruling class, and that's why we're increasingly seeing bipartisanly in the Biden administration, Obama administration, but also in the Trump administration, an increasing turn towards this new Cold War footing that the US is on with China, and framing China as this existential threat, not just to America's economic dominance, but to our national security. This idea that China is going to invade us tomorrow if we don't start prepping right now. And we're seeing that really, happen more intensely with every passing day. I also want to take a moment to talk about de-dollarization. This is something we sort of nodded towards in week 2 when we talked about sanctions and dollar hegemony and dollar imperialism, how the fact the US dollar is the global reserve currency, it is the currency that every country in the world uses to engage in international trade, how that really reinforces America's dominance on the world stage. Obviously, it also reinforces America's ability to sanction whoever they want. If countries need US dollars to trade, to import food, medicine, infrastructure, materials, and so on, and the US sanctions them, they're cut off from the economy, they can't get their dollars, and then that starves their people, that starves their economies, right? So unsurprisingly, there's a lot of interest from global South countries, particularly those like Russia and Iran and others who are facing sanctions, to pursue alternatives. So this idea of de-dollarization refers to a potential or actual decline in the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency, its status as a medium of exchange, and its replacement either by a new international currency or by other countries' national currencies that are being used to greater degrees. There is no doubt, like I don't want to overstate the case. You do hear people really overstate the case about this sometimes. There's no doubt that the dollar is by far the dominant currency in the world today. The vast majority of transactions are still denominated in US dollars. It is the largest currency held in reserves in various countries' central banks. But there's been a steady decline in 2000, according to the IMF, the total foreign reserves held in the world central banks, the US dollar made up 70% of that. In 2023, that was just 55%. And we've seen, as these graphs shows, a rise in other currencies as well. And one of the big ones, and you see this here, is the RMB, the Chinese yuan, is the green part of that graph. And in addition to that, there's also been talks about, through platforms like the BRICS, which I'll talk about shortly, talks about creating a possible BRICS currency, or regional associations in Latin America or Africa elsewhere creating their own regional currencies to promote regional trade. These are all just sort of at the ideational stage, and leaders have alluded to them in speeches and had some meetings about them. There hasn't been concrete steps towards them. But the fact that this is even being talked about by leaders, like the fact that the president of Brazil, Lula, can even get on stage at an international forum in front of news outlets and talk about pursuing alternatives to the dollar, that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. And I think that really speaks to a very fundamental shift in the world today that has been exacerbated by the general economic instability caused by the Trump administration, particularly with the tariffs from earlier this year, which have reignited a lot of talk about de-dollarization and undermined a lot of people's trust, particularly like investors elsewhere in Europe, like in the global north. A lot of financial markets and investors are losing trust in the dollar's status as sort of a safe haven asset, as in the stability of the US dollar. It's notable that usually whenever you have economic turmoil, actually the dollar will get stronger. Investors will buy more treasury bonds because they know that the treasury bonds are a very reliable, very trustworthy and stable asset, and that strengthens demand for the US dollar. So it strengthens the value of the US dollar. That's usually what you'd expect whenever there's a big economic turmoil in the world. Instead, when Trump imposed tariffs back in April on quote unquote Liberation Day, rather than people flocking to buy treasury bonds and increase demand for the dollar, there was an unprecedented and massive sell-off of those bonds, which caused the US dollar to lose nearly 10% of its value and sink to a 3-year low. Thus far, in the first half of 2025, the US dollar has lost 10% of its value, which is the worst start to a year the dollar has had in 5 decades, since the sort of economic crisis of the 1970s. And this really betrays, I think, a crisis of confidence in the dollar. And this is not just me saying this. After the tariffs were imposed back in April, the head of foreign exchange research at Deutsche Bank, so one of the biggest banks in Europe, George Taravellos, issued a note to the bank's investors warning of a growing crisis of confidence in the US dollar. And he wrote, quote, "The market is rapidly de-dollarizing. In a typical crisis environment, the market would hoard dollar liquidity to secure funding for the underlying US asset base. Dynamics here seem to be very different. The market has lost faith in US assets, so that instead of closing the asset liability mismatch by hoarding dollar liquidity, it's actively selling down the US assets themselves." And that is just finance speak for saying there's a crisis of confidence in the US dollar that even the senior executives at Deutsche Bank, of all places, are recognizing and warning their investors about. And we're really seeing that play out in this tumble in value the dollar has seen over the course of this year. And just a couple weeks ago in June, Bank of America actually conducted a survey of fund managers, hedge funds and other sort of investment funds around the world. And those found that the investors are holding the smallest percentage of dollar denominated assets in their portfolios in nearly 2 decades. So again, that's just more sort of data to bear out the fact that countries around the world, not just in the South, are losing faith in the US dollar. And that does open up possibilities for thinking about alternatives, whether that is increasing trade in other currencies like the ruble or the yuan or others, or talking about other regional or global currencies as well. And that sort of brings me into the final big shift I want to talk about, which is expansion of the BRICS and more generally like a growing sort of emphasis among global South countries on South-South cooperation and South-South integration. The most prominent example of this is the BRICS. I'm sure folks have heard about this. This is not really a bloc, but a grouping of countries that started out in the 2000s as BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in 2010, expanded to include South Africa as well. So that's where you get the S in BRICS. And so throughout the 2010s, this was sort of these 5 countries, large regional powers in the global South, that would come together every year to foster cooperation, trade, and so on between them. But starting in 2024, the BRICS began expanding, which had never happened before, apart from when South Africa joined. So in 2024, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE all joined the BRICS. Argentina initially was invited to join and accepted, but then after the far right government of Javier Milei came to power, he withdrew that invitation because he has, really aligned himself with the West and particularly with the United States. And then 2025, Indonesia joined as a full member, and 8 other countries, so that's Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan, were all added as partner countries with the understanding that that is sort of a way to onboard them eventually into full membership in the BRICS, but they can still come participate every year in the summits and in the sort of proceedings of the organization. And so this is based on the 2023 expansion. So this doesn't talk about the many countries that have joined this year, but this just shows sort of countries that have joined and their share of global GDP, population, oil production, and exports. And so with the most recent expansion from this year, BRICS Plus, which is sometimes the term used to describe this newly expanded grouping, now makes up more than half the world's population and nearly 42% of the global GDP. So this is like a really serious grouping to be contended with. And there have been many initiatives that BRICS has pursued. There's this new development bank that we've talked about in week 3. But now there's also more recently been pursuit of developing an international payment system called BRICS Pay. And what this is meant to be is an alternative to the SWIFT system, which is essentially the system by which banks around the world talk to each other when doing international transactions. So if I'm wiring money to a bank in London from my account at PNC Bank, PNC and the British bank will talk to each other using the SWIFT system, and that is dominated by Western powers, especially the U.S., meaning that when the U.S. sanctions a country, and we saw this especially with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, one of the ways we do that is by completely cutting them out of the SWIFT system, making it impossible for them to process international transactions unless by other very complicated alternatives. So by having an alternative payment system like BRICS Pay, this would allow countries to essentially sidestep U.S. sanctions that, as we've talked about, are really devastating and don't actually accomplish their goals, but really just harm the populations, and especially the most vulnerable populations of countries that are under U.S. sanctions. And as I mentioned before, Brazil's President Lula has also advocated for a common currency among BRICS countries as an alternative to the U.S. dollar. That is, again, just sort of at the idea stage right now, but it's being talked about, which is more than we could have said 10 years ago. So this is sort of the biggest example of this upsurge in South-South cooperation. I don't have a slide for it, but I do also want to talk just about the anti-colonial upsurge that we're seeing in Africa in particular, and in West Africa and the Sahel states. We've seen these rise of popular movements opposing French neocolonialism, both military and financial, in West Africa, and the rise of governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that are pursuing greater integration through this alliance of Sahel states, kicking out French companies, nationalizing uranium mines and other economic interests that have been owned by French companies, and really taking that power back into the hands of these countries as an assertion of sovereignty and also collective defense, because these countries have come together into an alliance. And we're seeing protests against neocolonialism and neoliberalism happening right now in Kenya and Togo and elsewhere across Africa as well. It's happening across the global south, but Africa in the last couple of years has really been a centerpiece of this, and a renewed interest in sort of Pan-Africanist sentiment as well, and African integration is something that's really important to highlight. So those are some of the big shifts that we have seen. And I want to now take a step back before we sort of shift into a discussion mode to evaluate some of these shifts and talk about what to make of them. I want to take a moment just to talk about this idea of multipolarity. I'm sure folks have heard of this. This gets talked about a lot, especially in online discussions about what's happening in the global order. This question of, are we entering a multipolar world? For what that means, we often talk about polarity being the number of powers that exert sort of like centralized control on the world stage. So during the Cold War, there was this bipolar competition where the US and the Soviet Union had blocs that coalesced around them, and these two blocs were rivals, but it was these poles of power in the US and the USSR. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the US emerged as this unipolar force in the world, and we were in a unipolar world order that has continued. Some would say we're still in it today, and maybe arguably we are still in it today. The US is still a hegemonic force, but that is starting to crack up, right? That's starting to break down. And now the question rises of, are we entering a multipolar world? This is something that is very hotly debated. Would love to hear folks' thoughts on that in the discussion, if folks have thoughts. Just to offer one way of thinking about it, I think people sometimes use this term multipolarity to assume that we're entering a world where like the world's going to be divided up between several different large powers. The US will have its sphere of influence, China will have its own, Russia will have its own, maybe Brazil and Turkey and so on. I don't think and I think that like that is where people often take issue with the idea of multipolarity because it doesn't really seem like that's very likely to actually happen. But I think that if we think of multipolarity instead as just more of a general sort of like a more chaotic world situation where there isn't really a single power dominating the world as a hegemonic force, but there are many regional powers that exert various degrees of influence in some ways, don't exert as much influence in others. Some countries will ally with each other on certain points, but will ally with other countries on others. It is just a more sort of like level and therefore chaotic playing field that is still multipolar in the sense that there's many different smaller concentrations of power, but it's not quite the very clean cut division of the world that people sometimes talk about it as. So that's why I find multipolarity to be a useful framework for thinking about the world that we are now increasingly entering, but that is very much a subject of debate, particularly on the left. So just wanted to sort of talk about that since that's something that does come up a lot in these conversations. I want to also draw attention to something that Vijay Prashad, who, if folks who've been coming to this know that I love Vijay Prashad. He's the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute, and he and his colleagues at Tricontinental have talked about what they call a new mood in the global south. This is sort of this idea that global south countries are increasingly feeling empowered to, in various ways, defend their own sovereignty, assert their sovereignty, pursue a more multilateral world, and stand up to and challenge the West directly, like really call out the West's hypocrisy, call out the West's violence and imperialism in ways that they weren't as empowered to before. And so this is a quote from an interview that I believe he did with Counterpunch, talking about what he means by this new mood in the global south, which is really emphasizing sovereignty and multilateralism and regionalism as well. This obviously brings up a lot of like challenges and contradictions. And one thing I want to offer up as just sort of a provocation, again, for folks to engage with in discussion, is that I think Stacey talked about how during the Cold War, you had this rise of third worldism, the solidarity between global South countries that was very explicitly anti-colonial. And this idea that the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America have this shared experience of neo-colonial exploitation and that they need to stand together to sort of remake the world order. I think the current trend that we're seeing is towards a similar politics of non-alignment in the sense that countries are pursuing, they're not really aligning themselves as closely with the US or with other powers, but are pursuing their own national interests. But it is still much about their own individual national interests, and it's sort of non-alignment without third worldist solidarity to the same degree that we've seen in the past. And it's about sort of like having more favorable terms for your own country's integration into the world system rather than challenging the logic of that world system sort of at a structural level. That's sort of my thesis about what to make of this. And I think we see this a lot with sort of like people have made this criticism of the BRICS countries in particular, which is that the BRICS is a useful platform for these countries to come together and engage in dialogue and sort of like integrate and cooperate in some ways, but there isn't a shared political project of remaking the world order in quite the same way that there was with the Bandung Conference or other expressions of third worldism throughout the 20th century. And of course, one of the other challenges is the US, although we are in a dying empire, it is still an empire. The US is still, without a doubt, the largest and most powerful military force in the world. We have 800 plus military bases all over the world. We are the only country that's ever used a nuclear weapon in conflict, and there's no ruling out that we would do that again. And as empires die, history teaches us, as empires begin to die, they become much more volatile, much more prone to lashing out in very unpredictable and very dangerous ways. And we've seen this with the escalation of the U.S. bombing Iran, sort of crossing a red line that previous presidents, even the first Trump administration, wouldn't have crossed. And so that is a very much a challenge to this moment of global shift. I think offers up many opportunities to think about remaking the world order, but there are many challenges, and the continued dominance of the United States and the power the US has is, I think, one of them. With that, I want to stop here and get into the discussion for the rest of this time. So I've put these three questions here on the board. One, do you think multipolarity is an accurate framework for understanding the current shifts in the global order? Why or why not? Two, what is our responsibility as anti-imperialists in the imperial core, especially that we're here in DC in the belly of the beast, when it comes to navigating these shifts? And I'm thinking especially of like this sort of tension that comes up of being anti-imperialists, but sometimes that puts us in the position of defending countries that are victimized by imperialism, but those countries are, governed by regimes that are reactionary, that are bourgeois, that are capitalist, that don't align with our politics as socialists. But the fact that we need to defend them from imperialism is central to our anti-imperialist politics. So what is our responsibility? How do we sort of navigate that nuance? And then finally, taking into consideration not just today's content, but everything we've learned about empire over the last 6 weeks, how do you think that this should inform the way we, as organizers, as activists, go about the practical work of resisting empire, organizing against empire from within the belly of the beast, from within the imperial core? Yeah, can we hand you the mic?
Hi, I'm Imani. For the first question, do I think multipolarity is an accurate framework? I definitely agree with the shifts that I think you've pointed out, especially because my kind of knowledge comes from a lot of like the Caribbean and Africa. I'm half Jamaican. And so I definitely see countries like CARICOM becoming more of a staple in the global framework. I see people like the Prime Minister of Barbados. She is very insistent that the United States is trying to make sure that Barbados stays with the United States instead of shifting over to China. And she's saying, "This is my country. I can do what I want, basically. Can't like bully us into staying with you." However, I do think we need to be careful about being so willing to move away from the United States that we go towards other countries that maybe are using the same tools, particularly China. I think it is definitely a good way to remove the global south away from the United States. But I think I'm seeing a lot of the same rhetoric of like, we can help you, we can do this, we can do that for your countries. And I don't know if all the countries in the global south are in the position to defend themselves legally, economically from predatory lending. I definitely do agree that the United States is intentionally putting these perception on China of like being a predatory country or being not good for the global south. But I do think it's important to be conscious of the fact that even though China is not the United States and will go about it differently, it is still important to prevent the world from becoming again first world and second world, and the second world is now China. That's just my concern about that. But I do think multipolarity is a good framework because you can see countries not really going, I'm with the United States all the way, or I'm with Russia all the way, or I'm with China all the way. They're more interested in what position benefits me the most at this time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a really important nuance.
Hi, my name is Ishan. So this is, I mean, like this is literally all I study at school, right? Like I think multipolarity is kind of an inevitability at this point. I think even if Trump hadn't come around, I think it still would have been, but I think that kind of just has accelerated things in a lot of ways, given his, bombastic nature. And I think it doesn't really do Americans any good to pretend otherwise, right? Or to try and fight or resist something that is inevitable, right? And so I think kind of connecting to the second question, yeah, I don't really know what the answer is to like what the new world will be and what the role of the United States would be in it. But I do know that it's important for people who, question war, question imperialism, question these kind of darker aspects of American foreign policy to be very actively involved in shaping those discussions, to be in the room, to be at the table, because it's kind of a free for all at this point, right? And we can have, I think, have a very outsized role in shaping a much more responsible foreign policy going forward, one that kind of recognizes the inevitability of a world where the US is not the only one calling the shots anymore. And rather than just kind of lashing out, like bombing Iran, for example, interacting with countries more as equal partners rather than we're here to teach you to show the way. And I really like your point as well about kind of resisting the temptation to just automatically see other countries as inherently good just because they're challenging the United States, because other countries too have similar motivations to us, right? And can do similarly negative or bad things to other countries, and kind of approach the global south with a similar perspective as they get more powerful. So I think it's important to question centralized power wherever we see it, regardless if it's the United States or someone else. So
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really well said.
Just 2 points. So for the second question, we kind of talked about it last week too with Stephanie, but I think just remembering that like we don't know what's best just because we're against, like we're anti-imperialist to the US. Like we still need to listen to the countries that are having, either the leaders that we don't agree with or whatever. We still need to listen to what they need instead of just like, well, we obviously know best because like we're fighting this from the inside. But it's like, no, we probably don't. They probably know what's best. So like that's something to work on. And then for the last question, some of it is just like the talking piece of it, which is really hard. But like since we've been doing this, I've been like trying to talk to more people and more friends about like what this is or like what they know or what they think about it. And one of my friends works for contracts with USAID, and she was like very defensive. She was like, well, what are they talking about? Why are they saying USAID is bad? I was like, I never said they said USA was bad. They were just saying, they were teaching people like, hey, this is actually like some of the history behind it, and kind of like going through some of that. Because I mean, while we're having this, not everyone knows that. So like, it's really important to kind of have those conversations in a non-combative, like, we're not trying to come for you because like y'all didn't know, or you know, you're just kind of existing in this world like we are. So those are
Well, thank you so much. I just want to add like one thing on this question of what our responsibility is as anti-imperialists, and this has been on my mind a lot. I actually got on a flight at 6 a.m. this morning from Chicago because I was at the socialism conference giving a talk on like exactly this, and we had a lot of conversations about the same point. And something that always like comes to mind for me is that, you know, as like a Marxist, I think about like the way things develop is by the contradictions heighten, and then that precipitates the development of history, right? As contradictions in social relations heighten, and there are contradictions in all of this, but like, you know, Mao said that imperialism is the principal contradiction in the world today, and that until you resolve that contradiction, like imperialism is capitalism on a global scale, right? And so you cannot talk about overthrowing capitalism, you can't talk about building a liberated or just world until you resolve the principal contradiction, the one that structures all others, which is imperialism. And I think to me, in the way the world system is set up today, the United States and the dominance of the United States is the linchpin of that world system. The US is the like enforcer of that. And so that's why I think it is like, especially given that like I'm based, you know, in DC, I'm in the belly of the beast. Like it is about like, I think like the decline of of America's imperial hegemony is a good thing, even though it's going to create other contradictions. You know, like you said, China is going to step in to fill the gap, and that's not going to be a perfect solution. It's going to cause a lot of problems. China is going to engage. Chinese companies are going to engage in the same exploitative practices in, you know, mines in Africa that American or European companies are doing as well, and there are going to be contradictions in that as well. But if you remove this sort of like ever-present looming specter of the United States that is shown throughout history that it will overthrow and invade and assassinate your leaders or invade your country if you try to do anything to assert your sovereignty. If the America's ability to do that is diminished, that also opens up space for people's movements. Ultimately, you know, power lies with the people in the global south too. It's not their governments, but it's the people of these countries. Their ability to resist against any form of exploitation or defend their sovereignty, so like meaningfully, is going to be only possible if the US isn't as able to prevent that from happening. And I want to return to, I should have had a slide for it, but I had someone, you know, read this quote on the slide in the very first session from Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian revolutionary, where he said that, quote, imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. That's a quote that I think about pretty much every day. And I think that, you know, that last sentence, wherever you strike it, you damage it, we're only capable of striking imperialism where we are. And where we are is here in the belly of the beast in the United States. So I think anything that we can be doing to strike at it, undermine it, you know, people are taking direct action against arms manufacturers, people are pressuring their representatives, but also just like breaking down the sort of misconceptions and propaganda Americans have bought into about imperialism. Like that is damaging American empire from within. And I think that is a really core element of our responsibility. So it makes me so happy to hear you say that, you know, you've been taking these lessons from the series out into the world and talking to people. And I hope folks will continue to do that. Sorry, that was like I'll get off the soapbox. That was a very long thought, but I just yeah, that came to mind. But yes, please.
Similar to what Pranay was saying about the second question and those contradictions, I think a lot about when you think about BRICS and like kind of like the politics of like India and like just generally like how as a socialist, like it's really hard to align yourself with something like that given like their national kind of agenda. But I think those like contradictions themselves are what will eventually give rise to, like in a very like traditional like Marxist Leninist kind of frame, people actually being able to reconcile those differences. And then kind of on the third question, I feel like for me, the thing that's gotten, I think, the most ability for folks who might not be super in tune with like how imperialism affects us all is really like leaning into the point that Stacey made about the imperial boomerang and like focusing on how like the tools of empire will eventually like come home and kind of connecting it to like to India and to Gaza of saying like, you know, these are the same kind of tactics that they're now using with folks in immigration, and with whether it be like through companies that they're using, or weapons or defense people that they're using, just really focusing on how all of those things are very connected to the same way that folks are being treated and surveilled in Gaza or in Kashmir or any of these places, has been kind of, I think, the most like pulling factor for people who are like, otherwise, like, this is a very separate thing from me kind of thing.
Totally. And to that point about the imperial boomerang, this is something that someone had said in the Q&A of my talk the other day at the conference, is that like we think about the imperial boomerang in relation to like state repression, right? Like methods of torture and counterinsurgency, and these violent methods of repression are perfected in the colonies and then applied back at home, and that's the rise of fascism. I mean, we're seeing that now with the militarization of police and ICE, right? But also, like, that boomerang happens with like the political economy of imperialism. If we think about how we talked about in weeks 2 and 3, at like one of the main ways that imperialism keeps the global south under its thumb is by imposing austerity and these like neoliberal reforms, structural adjustment that cut social spending, cut the social safety net, and really make these governments and economies very neoliberal. Like, we're experiencing that here at home, right? I mean, this like this bill that just got passed by Congress is like cutting Medicaid, and but it's the largest defense budget in history. All these things, like, that is another way in which these practices that are first applied in the global south or in the periphery, even peripheral countries in Europe. This is something that Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister and Marxist economist, has written about, that countries like Greece are sort of on the periphery of Europe, and they were the first during the European financial crisis to experience these austerity regimes imposed by Germany and France and their central banks. Later, that gets then brought back to the metropole, to the imperial core, in much more devastating ways. So another way to think about it, I think, even as we're organizing and talking to people and tying these things to the issues of like the American working class, like, it's the same forces that are keeping like the people of Kenya under these like neoliberal exploitative regimes are also the same forces why like we don't have a public healthcare system in this country. And that, I think, is like a powerful way to tie that together. Yes.
We've got a comment in the chat from Kyle, who says, I think the decline of US hegemony will likely strengthen the national bourgeoisie in the global south countries, BRICS, etc., fostering greater national sovereignty and independent development. However, as Pranay noted, this shift will also reconfigure contradictions within these societies. In my opinion, it's important to analyze these dynamics through class analysis, not moralistic frameworks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can repeat that. Just essentially what Kyle was saying, right, was that like the decline of US hegemony will strengthen national bourgeois elements in global south countries, lead to more sovereignty and like nationalist sentiment, which is good in some ways, but also creates contradictions that we should analyze through class dynamics and like a Marxist analysis, rather than a moral framework of good, of like right and wrong, good and evil. And that's something that Vijay Prashad, like, I actually, you would ask me to plug my podcast at some point during this. I will do that. I have a podcast, an anti-imperialist podcast called Return to Bandung, and one of the episodes I interviewed Vijay Prashad, and something he said that has stuck with me from that is that, in his words, like the way he framed it was, there is no politics of purity, there are only the contradictions. And that's something I think about like a lot ever since. And yeah, I think that's a good way to think about this.
I also really like the idea of like not really thinking of it as like good or bad, or even going back to your question of like if there are governments that don't align with our politics, because I think thinking of it as like in politics, it almost feels like another kind of like saving missionary mission of like, we're going in and this is our burden of trying to make sure these governments are doing the right thing for their people. But I think for me, the purpose of anti-imperialism and getting rid of neocolonialism and all of that, and like keeping governments in their countries, is that these difficulties in countries, these situations are the right of the people of the country. Like, you're going to have difficulties in your countries, but there should be no higher power coming into your country telling you how to resolve it, telling you what is going on. I think that's the main thing that I've always had a problem with, is that people should be allowed to have the freedom to solve their own regional problems without another country coming in and their motivations affecting it. So I really like that, those points of like, it's not a purity thing, it's not good or evil, it's how can we allow these people to live their lives and choose their own governments how they want to.
Totally. I think that's so important. I mean, even to take it one step further, right? It's not just that like the peoples of these countries should be empowered to like solve their own problems, but like that's the only way the problems can actually be solved. Like, even if the US was like a socialist utopia, we could not promote socialism in the global south by like invading these countries and installing socialist governments. That would fail, and that has failed in the past when other countries have tried to do that, right? Like ultimately the only way to liberate people is for people to do that themselves through struggle, and that means through sacrifice, and like things get worse before they get better, but that's the only way it's going to happen here. It's the only way it's going to happen anywhere else. So I think that's a really important point to bring up. Other thoughts? Yes.
I'm wondering, you quoted Mao about imperialism being the greatest contradiction. I'm almost wondering if it makes sense to flip Mao on his head and to say, we're in the belly of the beast. In the belly of the beast, we can try to rally the American people or the American working class against empire. And say we have to overthrow empire in order to establish more equality and democracy and, you know, economic liberation here. Would it make, if we were to promote the class struggle here more successfully, would that undermine the empire from another side? Just a thought, and I don't know if that makes sense or not.
That's an excellent question. Do the folks have thoughts and want to reflect on that? Yeah.
I mean, my thought would be, if we succeed in that here, that removes a major obstacle for similar movements in other parts of the world, because as Pranay said during the presentation, so many, like Allende in Chile, Mossadegh in Iran, and all sorts of other places, Lumumba in Congo, for example, it's been the US and US allies who've basically cut that head off that and put a big stop sign there. Nope, you have to do something else. And so without the US doing that role, then people like Allende, Mossadegh, Lumumba, they would be able to actually do something in their countries.
I just wanted to add a quick note from Bob in the chat saying that the basis of change is internal, but the condition of change is external.
That's a very powerful point. The basis of change is internal, but the conditions of change are external. I'll add my thoughts on what you said. Is that, I mean, I think the answer to your question is yes. I think like ultimately like the way we have to like overthrow the current system is by raising class consciousness among the American working class, and that's appealing to the interests of the American working class and the fact that American workers are, even though we benefit from imperialism in various ways because we can go to the store and get bananas year round really cheap, like we are exploited by imperialism and by capitalism in so many other ways, right? Because the reason we're able to get those bananas cheap is bolstered by America's military might that enforces these relations around the world. That means we're spending $1 trillion on the Pentagon and not spending money on healthcare and education and fixing our roads and bridges, right? And I think like that appealing, I think especially talking about like cutting like the US military budget and drawing that money towards like providing for our people here is a really powerful way to like appeal to Americans' interests and raise that. And then it has the effect of undermining imperialism on a global scale. I think like one way we saw this obliquely, because it's not at the level of national politics, but actually people like waking up to this to an extent is in the like debate for the New York mayor primary, where that moment where like they asked all the candidates, what's the first country you'd visit? And then everyone said Israel. And then Zoran Mamdani is like, I would stay in New York and talk to New Yorkers. And I'll talk to Jewish New Yorkers by going to like their synagogues and their communities, but I don't need to go to Israel for that. And then you had all of these people like on the right and the left being like, yeah, why is the mayor of an American city being like asked about like going to Israel? That doesn't make any sense. And, the expectation that the New York mayor has to travel to Israel, which they've always done, that is an expression of like American imperialism, because Israel is an outpost of US empire, as Alexander Haig said, the largest unsinkable aircraft carrier the US has. Like, I think people are realizing like that's bullshit, and that is like what resonated with people is Zoran talking about making New York an affordable city that people can afford to pay rent and afford to buy groceries in. And like, that's what resonates with people. I think that is kind of a version of what you were just talking about. And I think we need more of that. Like, and I think that also proves that you can make those messages resonate, not just at like the congressional or presidential level of politics, but at like local politics as well. And that's, I think, a very powerful lesson for us to take from that.
think also kind of to your point, or another way that we can really try and do that is, I mean, I know everyone's like got jokes about social media and how bad it is for us, but like make it work for us then. Like that's how all of us have just like watched everything unfold in Gaza. So like how can we also continue to help like tell the stories of the people that are affected by this, or like remind us that like everyone's affected by this, like especially with this bill and everything. Like this is the days of like, oh, that doesn't affect me, I don't need to worry about that. That's pretty much over unless you're like in a very small percentage. So just like really making sure to kind of lean into that and use that, and not just like, well, the world is hard, so we're just gonna watch cat videos. Like, cool, but also like do other things to kind of continue that message.
Absolutely. Your thoughts? Anything online? I think we can close this session out. I just want to say, like, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much for coming out to this. And there's like a lot of familiar faces here, and it's been fun to see folks like coming out consecutively over the last 6 weeks, but also to the new folks who are joining us today. Thank you for joining us. I mean, this was a project that like started as like an idea on one of our internationalism working group Zoom calls, and it didn't really like I don't know, I didn't expect it to being as successful as it has been. And so I really hope that we can continue to do this in the future, and that folks have, as like my comrade back here said, like found this useful and provided useful context to go out into the world and organize with. Because ultimately, like, you know, the purpose of why we study, why we engage in political education isn't just to make ourselves smarter or make ourselves more correct. That is just like you know, a cherry on top that we are more correct. But in fact, the real purpose is to make us more effective organizers, and ultimately make us, you know, more effective at raising consciousness among other people. With that, I will close this out. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday.